All right, welcome to the Global and Domestic Economic Overview session. Just as a reminder, the AXA Live Q&A is now open. It will remain open for the duration of the session, so please follow the instructions that are on the screen to send in your questions and comments at any stage. This session aims to provide you with an overview of the global and domestic economic environment, and hopefully along the way we'll also provide you with some insight into where opportunities might lay today and in the near future, and how to capitalise from this environment for the benefit of your members. To kick off the conversation, we're fortunate today to have two experts who will share their views on the global and domestic economic environment. On my immediate right, Mark Wills is Head of Investment Solutions Group with State Street Global Advisors, and to Mark's right, Stephen Walters is Chief Economist with JP Morgan in Australia. Their bios are contained in the program booklet and in the program app. Each speaker will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, which will leave somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes for questions. So start thinking about the questions that you might want to ask and send them through, and I'll try and prioritise some of them as they come through on the screen, and we'll also have some roving mics to get questions from the audience. So without further ado, if I can introduce Stephen as the Chief Economist from JP Morgan Australia to share his view with us.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So look, as Sam said, I'll talk for about 10 minutes just on the global and Australian outlooks, and I'll spend most of my time talking about Australia and leave the main global input to Mark on my left. But look, I'll give you some context on the global story though, just so you know what our economists at JP Morgan are saying. And I think when you look around at the world economy at the moment, there's a lot of things to be worried about. And there always is. There's always things that you get concerned about. But I think at the moment, there's really heightened anxiety about a lot of matters. Like there's things about the slowdown in China. I was up in China last week just having a look around up in Shanghai and thereabouts, and there's a lot of concerns about the slowdown in China. There's what's going on in Europe. Obviously, Greece has got its problems and effectively has defaulted again on its obligations to the rest of Europe. There's the Federal Reserve in the US about to start withdrawing the policy stimulus that's been there. Markets are very worried about that. And obviously there's the big fall in commodity prices that really has hurt a big parts of Australia's economy. Now, particularly oil prices going down, that is actually a benefit to us, but it's got a lot of attention for obviously the LNG industry in Australia is quite exposed to that. So when you look through those sort of factors, they get a lot of attention in markets. People like Mark and I and Sam talk about it a lot. Gets a lot of input on television, and you seem to get very focused on the negatives, but JP Morgan's view, for what it's worth, is actually quite constructive. We look through a lot of those bad things that appear to be going on in the global economy and things we should be worried about, and think there's a lot of good things that are going on, and I'll just run through some of those very quickly. So number one, and I think probably most importantly, is the US economy's almost healed itself post the financial crisis that started back in 2008. And that's why the Federal Reserve is starting to at least talk about withdrawing policy stimulus. It's because the economy is in much better shape. That's good news. The other is Europe. Even though there's a lot of noise around Greece and potentially some other problems in other parts of the periphery of the European economy, Europe's actually growing again. And in our forecasts at JP Morgan, we've got growth in Europe above 2% this year. So again, you get very focused on Greece, which is a very, very small part of the European economy, and yet the rest of Europe, Germany in particular, is growing at about 3%. So that's a very good positive as well. Another big one that doesn't get a lot of attention here at all is Japan. Japan's been in deflation for the best part of the past 20 years, and yet they're out of deflation now, as in prices in Japan actually are going up, which is a very good thing, and their economy is growing. Not quite as quickly as we'd like, but it is actually growing. And remember, Japan takes about 18% of Australia's exports, even now. Having been in deflation for 20 years, they still take a large portion of our exports, so that's another positive. Fourth is that inflation's very low, so that's good. That's allowing central banks to keep interest rates very low, and as we're all consumers, the lower oil prices go, the more income we've got freed up to spend on other things. So I think that's another big positive. Fifth, as I've sort of mentioned already, is that interest rates around the world are very, very low. And in fact, even if the US does start raising interest rates sometime soon, which we think they will, they're currently sitting at zero interest rates. And interest rates in Europe are at zero, they're at zero in Japan, they're at zero in the UK, and very, very low in other places. So that's very, very good as well. Frees up a lot of domestic household income. That's a good thing. And also, just on commodity prices, our analysts think the reason commodity prices have been falling so much is not a weakness of demand, but too much supply. Now, okay, prices go down and that hurts the energy exporters, but it's the reasons that prices have gone down we think are quite constructive. So to wrap all that up, look, growth is a little bit under what we thought it would be by now. Globally, it's growing. The global economy is growing at about 2% and a bit. By the end of this year, we think it'll be growing somewhere at about 3% and a bit. So we think we've got a full percentage point acceleration in GDP growth this year, and hence our very constructive outlook. But there's always things to worry about. There's always risks. Is Greece going to get bounced out of Europe? Possibly, but we don't think so. Will China have a hard landing? Possibly, but we don't think so. Will the Fed mismanage raising interest rates in the US? Possibly, but we don't think so. So it's generally a very constructive outlook. Now I'll move on to Australia, and then I'll hand over to Mark. And unfortunately on Australia, and I must admit that's where I spend most of my time looking at the Australian economy and trying to work out what's going on with interest rates and exchange rates and our central bank and so on. And I don't think the story's as constructive as the one I just told you globally, unfortunately. And the context here is that Australia's delivering some decent enough GDP growth. Like our economy is growing at sort of 2.5%, and we hardly skipped a beat during the global crisis. We had 1 quarter of negative growth, but we've had positive growth pretty much every quarter for the last 24 years. And remember, there's only one economy in the world that's done better than that ever, and that's the Netherlands. So we've got a pretty good track record, but I think the main problem for Australia is that GDP growth masks a pretty poor income story in the economy. It actually, I think the economy feels a lot weaker than 2.5% to 3% that we're delivering on our GDP growth. And there's a few reasons for that. Now, one is wages growth's quite low, and we all suffer from that. As the unemployment rate goes up, we know wages growth's quite weak. There's obviously budget savings trying to be implemented at both state and federal level. But the big one is the terms of trade's going down. Now, for the non-economists out there, the terms of trade is our export prices divided by our import prices. And admittedly, we had 10 years where that went pretty much straight up as coal prices went up and iron ore prices went up in particular. But as those prices come down, it unleashes a really big negative income flow through the economy. And the problem with that is we're getting decent GDP growth, but we're all getting our income, or at least our income growth, squeezed. And the other problem, I think, is that also that the GDP growth we're getting is largely the benefits of that investment boom in mining we saw over the past decade. So we're getting much more growth in coal exports, iron ore exports, LNG exports. That's all great, delivers nice GDP growth numbers, but doesn't do a lot for the broader economy. It doesn't do anything for my income. I don't work for a mining company, I work for an American bank. That doesn't help me. And similarly, it's quite low, what we call low multiplier growth. So it's actually very, very capital intensive growth. It's not labour intensive growth. It's using all that additional capacity that the miners put in over the last 10 years in particular, which was very labour intensive. So what we're finding now is we're just not generating enough jobs in the economy, and that's why the unemployment rate's going up. The other problem was when the big terms of trade boom was on, our income kept going up. That did benefit me. I didn't work for a mining company during the terms of trade boom either. But what happened was, remember those tax breaks we got year after year after year, both under the coalition and then under Labor, and again under the coalition. We got tax breaks year after year, we got welfare payments going up, we got first homeowners grants, we got baby bonuses. All of that was funded by the terms of trade boom. That, as I said, the terms of trade's now going down, and that's why we're having all these federal budget issues, again by both sides of politics, is that the terms of trade boom's well and truly over. And that's generating this big income squeeze in the economy. But what it did, it also masked what was a pretty bad productivity effort. So you look back through the last, say, 15 years, I challenge you to nominate what were the really big reforms in the economy over that period, lasting reforms. Like there were some reforms put in by various political persuasions that were reversed, but the only really lasting long-term reform we've seen that helps productivity in the economy was tax reform under the GST. Now that's 15 years ago. Now when the terms of trade was going up, that didn't really matter. Productivity growth could be very low and our national income kept growing up. But now that the terms of trade's coming down, it's coming very much back to productivity is the key. And unfortunately, the way things are in Canberra, with the bit of dysfunction in leadership and the partisanship of the way our politicians are behaving right now, we're not getting much reform. And also, even if we did get reform, the payoffs from those reforms are very long term. They're not short term. In fact, they're quite painful near term. You get the benefits very long term, but politically, there's actually not much appetite for reform right now. So what can be done? Well, we've got a Reserve Bank sitting out there cutting interest rates, and that helps us all. Those with a mortgage, that certainly helps, and those with home loans certainly getting a benefit from that. But to me, that's a cyclical solution to a structural problem. Now, I've just gone through a whole range of reasons why the economy is not growing as quickly as the GDP numbers might suggest. Now, interest rates going down don't really change that. The Reserve Bank can't get governments to reform. They can't get consumers to spend. If there's this lack of what our Governor, Glenn Stevens, calls this animal spirits in the economy, both consumers and corporates are lacking this confidence or animal spirits that Keynes used to talk about, lowering interest rates won't change that. But it's the only lever the RBA's got. They're pulling it. We think they'll keep pulling that lever. Interest rates will keep going down. But again, I think it's a solution to a different problem. So I don't think it's really going to help. What else could we do? Well, reform. I've mentioned it already. We should get more reform in the economy, but we need some political will to do that. And if you've all been watching what's going on in Canberra, that's just not there at the moment. We had some reforms, for whatever their merits on education, were voted down last night. There's a lot of other reforms that both sides of government have tried to implement that have been voted down in a very partisan environment. So that's very unhelpful. And the other probably important one is the currency. So the Aussie dollar has been coming down. Remember, it's only 2 or 3 years ago was above parity with the US dollar. That's very painful for our economy. I checked this morning, we're running at about 76.3 now. That's a big depreciation, but it really needs to go down a lot further. And that's what the Reserve Bank is in some ways trying to engineer here, is to get our exchange rate down as interest rates come down and get some more sort of cohesive policy traction in Canberra. That'd be a massive boost. But it sounds a bit pessimistic, but just in the long term, remember, Australia's located in the right part of the world. I think the statistic that I saw recently from the IMF was that 2/3 of the world's middle class will live in Asia within 30 years. So we're in the right part of the world, we export the right materials, we export commodities and services, in other words, tourism, education and healthcare, and we're exporting to those economies over the next 20 or 30 years. I think we're in great shape, but I just think given the size of the boom we've had over the last 10 years was off the scale. We hadn't seen anything like it before, so the economy's in this period where it's trying to adjust and it's really struggling. But long term, I think our future is very bright.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Just a reminder to the audience, I've only had one question come through the online system. If you have questions, please use the app to ask questions. That would be great. I'll pass on to Mark now for his view on the global and domestic economy.
All right, so just picking up off one of the comments that Stephen made, there's an economic term called the Dutch disease, and that the point being in Holland, when they found a whole lot of natural gas, their currency went through the roof and they basically debased their underlying secondary industry. And that's what we've seen largely in Australia. And we totally echo his comments that we've got this huge adjustment period to go through. And when you talk about jobs creation and what are the things that make an economy, hum, if you look at the number of people, for example, in South Australia that work in the wine industry and compare it to the mining industry, a lot more people working in the wine industry than in the mining industry. And these are the sort of points that aren't well understood. When the Aussie dollar's above parity, it's pretty hard for the wine industry to make progress. So Australia, it's not sort of terrible. Domestic demand is so-so. The consumer's very cautious. Saying that, I live in a household of 4 women. They don't seem very cautious at all. But I think the biggest single risk right now is probably in the short term is this job situation and our inability to react. But probably with the rate cuts and the oil price, it's probably going to be enough to help us to creep through. So Australia is a bit of a non-story in a way. If you contrast Australia and also the machinations that Stephen mentioned that's going on in Canberra and you compare it to Japan, it is visceral. So you have a Prime Minister there who, waltzed over to the Bank of Japan and said, I'd like you to do X. And they said no, so he sacked half the board. That's what you call being, aggressive. So the thing with Japan is they've got an incredibly aggressive quantitative easing program, and basically Abe has said to the pensioners of Japan, I'm sorry, I'm going to eat away at your retirement income, but I'm going to give your grandkids jobs. And that's the bargain he's set. So they are stimulating, they are trying to get out of this deflationary mess that they've been in. And he's trying to sort of challenge a whole series of shibboleths that they've had in the Japanese society for many, many years. And it's not easy. If Abenomics is going to work, I don't think anyone really knows, but it's certainly going in the right direction. And at the moment, they're just going through the first series of wage negotiations, and apart from Toyota, it looks like it's starting to take hold. And it's pretty, you know, you think how hard can it be, but, you know, if you give people more money, they will spend it. And that's what the Japanese people have lacked. So, very, very constructive on Japan. The policy settings are good. They're spending money like crazy. They've got the yen down. They're competitive. So, and their trade numbers have improved. If you then go and look in Europe, their QE is a lot more complicated because you have, you know, the European Central Bank, which has limited powers compared to Japan. And you've probably all heard the phrase herding cats. That's the problem that the ECB has with the political dimension. Europe is going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The announcement of the QE was very positive, and the size and reach of it probably surprised people. But unlike Japan, it's not going to be smooth sailing. But to echo Stephen's, your forecast's above 2, I think the ECB is at 2. You know, when you think it was under 2 a year ago, that's a pretty positive outcome. So Europe has definitely pivoted pretty strongly. And the other thing is, remember, Europe exports things. And the euro is much lower. And we all like buying things mainly from Italian producers. But at the end of the day, we might joke about it, but again, the euro has been an incredible headwind for a lot of the European countries. So it's a really good start in the right direction. And it's interesting, you know, markets have responded. Like the euro stocks year to date is up 17%. So clearly people are starting to deploy money in that part of the world. But a long, tedious effort. US, it's the engine, as we all know. It's doing very well. It's recovered. Chair Yellen has one of the world's worst jobs. JP Morgan have a tightening forecast for June, but even in their literature it says on a knife's edge. Yesterday I went through a whole lot of independent research groups, 7 in fact. They all pivoted between June and September. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't even tighten at all next year. Given, I think, some of the issues that Stephen mentioned, that there are these sort of bigger geopolitical things, that I think Chair Yellen's going to be very nervous about upsetting the apple cart. And so I think a lot of her decision-making will be driven more by external factors than internal factors. The other thing is that even though people talk about wages picking up a little bit in the US, the flip side is you've got this massive reduction in inflation from the oil price, and interest rates are still very, very low. So there's not a lot, when you look at inflationary expectations, they're still pretty muted. So again, it's one of those I mean, the Fed governors don't know what they're going to do, let alone us trying to figure out what it is. China, really interesting. The government there, when they came out with the 3rd plenum, told us exactly what they were going to do. And unusually for governments, have done exactly what they said. They had a 40-point plan and they're implementing all of it. The property market there is terrible. They can't stimulate any more to get the economy moving. All the cash injections that are going into the economy are basically to stabilise debtor banks and that type of thing. And the amount of reconstruction of that financial system, not so much the economy, but the financial system, is a Herculean task. So it is probably one of the most extraordinary examples of misallocation of resources, and in years to come it'll be a case study, I think, for economics students. But interestingly, in a command economy, you can come in, you can investigate now over 130,000 party members for misdeeds, over 3,000 members of the armed forces above lieutenant colonel, 82 generals are all under investigation for corruption. This is really important because in the end of the day, the corruption is actually a symbol of what's been going wrong in China, which is a misallocation of resources. The fact that we can buy garden hoses in Bunnings as cheaply as we can is testament to that. But the point is, their incomes have increased 35 times in the last 20 years, I guess, something like that. So the point is, it's not like they're going to fall over, but the 7, 8, 9, 10% growth years are over. We're very much back to the, normal Western 7 or 6, 5, 4, that sort of level. The other interesting thing is, it's not that so if you think about China, it's not that our resource sector is going to fall in a heap, but it just won't be as unbelievably positive as it was. But we will have a growing Japan. We will have China still growing at somewhere probably around the 5.5% mark. They'll still buy a lot of rocks, buy a lot of coal, but it just won't be the halcyon days we had. So incredible period of adjustment, and we totally agree actually with the JP Morgan thing of getting better. The subplot is we've got these multi-speed economies. Australia and Canada are, pretty lousy. China's slowing, Japan's speeding up. You've got the US and the UK looking to increase rates, everyone else looking to decrease rates. So it's unusual, you've got this very uncoupled or decoupled global market. But generally, reasonably constructive. But what would be a presentation, Stephen, without trying to scare the children? So what really worries us, and we did a paper a couple of weeks ago, which was our 10 black swan events, which we published, and the first one was Russian default. And this is pretty identifiable, and if you had to assign a probability, it's not insignificant. The reason why it's really significant is as follows. Russian government organisations and corporates owe European banks about $150 billion US. Now, right now, most of those organisations are in some form of technical default. Russia produces oil at sort of the mid-$40 level. If oil goes down into the 30s, it's not a pretty picture. The reason why that's really important, that unlike the United States, big corporates in Europe borrow money from banks. Now, the European banks are in a much better situation now because of the asset quality review, but the last thing they need and Europe needs is one of these sort of jolts. So if you said to us, what do you think could be the biggest, worst thing that could happen? It would be that. So I think, while the oil price has done a lot of nice things for the consumer, it has really exposed some of these huge imbalances that have grown up in the last few years through the commodity boom. That could be a pretty messy unwind.
All right, thank you, Mark. We have the opportunity, we have some roving mics, so if you have a question that you'd like to ask from the floor, please indicate your desire to do so, and the mics will come around and bring to my attention. Could I start with a question to Mark? You started going down the path of talking about black swan events. Yep. I mean, clearly outliers are things that cause everyone in this room concern, but also cause us to question the longer term strategies that we may have put in place, and whether there's always a case to revisit those whenever such outlier events take place. What are, in addition to Russia defaulting, what would you say are some of the other, let me use the term less dramatic outlier events? Currency wars, for example, the US wanting to...
The US, I think Chair Yellen has the world's toughest job. Simple as that. It's impossible to speculate, as we said before, when or where, but the risk of getting it wrong, it can be enormous. And so I would say that's probably the other black swan event. And it's pretty straightforward. If they move, confuse the market in some way, get the language wrong, that type of thing. The other part is that off the back of just the rate shift, you've got this, you know, their balance sheet now is, how many trillion is it? $4 trillion. So they've got to take that and shrink it. So she's got to do both at the same time. I'm glad she's doing it and not me.
Nobody wants a strong currency.
Yeah, except the US. The US is sort of, they're an interesting market because, well, the US tends to trend for very long periods of time. About 25% of the US economy is sort of outwardly exposed. About 45% of the earnings of the S&P 500 come from offshore. But interestingly enough, it has shown the propensity in the past to be able to withstand that.
Okay. Any chance that the US resumes quantitative easing to stop their currency from escalating?
Oh, there's always a chance of that, but we think that's pretty low probability. Like Mark said, they've got a massive balance sheet because of the quantitative easing that they need to unwind now, and they need to do that while raising interest rates. It's a delicate mix. And just on the currency, US dollar's going up because most other economies are still doing QE, like Japan, the UK, Europe, and because the US economy is healing, as I said, so the currency should be going up, and they're one of the few central banks in the world close to raising interest rates, so their currency should be going up. So we see that as a sign of health rather than a sign of dysfunction.
Yeah. Can we turn our attention to domestic interest rates? Sol Lake, the Economist, was quoted this week as saying that he believes interest rates in Australia are likely to rise by the end of 2015, which is a remarkably short-term outlook, even for an economist. What are your thoughts on that view? Politely, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'll comment on that one. So, look, Saul's a great economist, and I know Saul well, and that's a bold forecast. Market pricing at the moment, for what it's worth, has another 2 interest rate cuts in Australia. My forecast is 1 more in May. I've got interest rate hikes in 2016, not in 2015, because I think the policy will ultimately work. That's what monetary policy is for. If it doesn't work, we need to throw out all the textbooks and go and do something else, because if it doesn't work, we've got major problems. But policy will work. We've seen it in the housing market. That's what happens. You lower interest rates, house prices go up. It's not rocket science. But ultimately, I think by next year, we would have the Bank of England will be hiking, we'll have the Federal Reserve hiking, the RBA would have taken the cash rate down to 2%. That's an all-time low. The record was set during the global crisis at 3%. We thought we'd never go back there again, and here we are at 2.25 today, heading towards 2. So I think they won't want to leave interest rates that low for too long. So I've got a similar view to Saul, that they'll be hiking sometime, but I just think it's next year rather than this year.
Okay. A question about the environment that everyone in this room operates in, and there's been a suggestion recently out of the federal government that there should be a debate on providing early access to superannuation, or at least a part of it, for young people to fund a first home. There might be other causes of similar worth in the future. Let's assume that were to be allowed. How do you think that would affect the economy?
I just think it'd be another piece of gasoline on the fire. And, I mean, one question as any economist that asks is, the provision of shelter that's what it's all about, putting a roof over someone's head. There's no inalienable right to actually owning a property versus renting a property. And I think most people in this room, and I think most financial commentators would agree, that the long-term efforts of superannuation is a pretty worthwhile objective. We don't have a shortage of housing, so the point is how we actually dwell in the property, i.e. by what economic means, in some ways you could say is relatively irrelevant. We may have grown up with an aspiration of owning a house, but there's many, many successful economies around the world that it's not the same way. So in economic terms, Sam, I think it's probably the last thing we need is things stoking the fire on, driving up house prices. And that would certainly do that.
All right. Can you please join in thanking both Stephen and Mark for today's session?